It didn't take long for the forest to close in on me, rattling my sense of direction. I tried my best to keep heading forward, but as I jumped over thick roots and ran around bushes, the task became increasingly difficult. All I could do was keep moving and pray that I was getting further away from the compound. I had overestimated how long I could run in such uneven terrain, and soon I was too exhausted to keep up a jogging pace. Blood ran like rapids around my ears, and I had to take ragged, uneven breaths before I could steady my breathing. Although I couldn't hear anyone chasing after me, I knew that stopping now would mean certain death. They always found runaways, and they always brought them back, and if I was to survive this, I had to keep going further and faster than anyone else before. In the dark, it was impossible to discern whether I was moving in circles, but I promised myself to keep going, no matter how slowly. No effort was in vain if it held even the slightest chance of getting me further away from that rotten place. Once my breathing returned back to its regular rhythm, I began to listen to the forest. As I walked, the sounds of birds and small animals were familiar, and through their calls and movements I could discern an impressive amount of information about what was going on nearby. That's why my heart sank to my stomach when I heard birds begin to flee in the distance, spooked by something close by. As they flew above the treetops and toward safer grounds, I squinted my eyes and began to look for cover. Although I couldn't hear it yet, something was coming, and I needed to hide. Under a large tree, I could see a small crevice between its bulky roots. The earth eroded from between them. I made my way to it, and with some careful squeezing, fit myself snugly underneath. It wasn't perfect. If someone were to look directly at me, they could easily spot me between the roots. But any time spent searching was more time for someone to find me, so I laid myself as small as I could across the cold earth and hoped that the darkness would shelter me. For a while, it was quiet. A beetle scampered across my arm, but I didn't dare swat it away in case I'd be alerting anyone of my presence. My right ear was pressed to the ground, and slowly I began to hear low thumps coming through the ground. A vibration, really, and it was getting louder. I lifted up my head and shifted my attention to my surroundings. It wasn't footsteps I'd heard. That thing was coming for me, and I needed to be ready. The ground began to faintly shake as it approached, and soon I could hear it stepping on the ground, sticks and leaves succumbing under the pressure of its gargantuan body. My heart pounded fast and loud, and for whatever reason, I was afraid that I could hear it through my skin, the distinct human heart pumping blood in a steady rhythm. It was close now, moving somewhere behind me, stopping every once in a while to gauge its surroundings. I begged it to change course for a mouse or a deer or some other poor soul to veer its attention away from me, but the forest kept quiet. It's like no living thing wanted to be near it, including me. The thing moved closer and closer, and for a faint moment I was convinced that it was sneaking up on me, and in the blink of an eye I would find myself wrapped in its fleshy tendrils, looking into its crimson eyes as it held me midair, ripping the limbs apart from my body, leaving nothing but an aching, defiant torso. Fear surged through me, but I had to do my best to tamp it down. Fear inhibited survival, and survival was priority number one. Its hooves scraped rocks and cracked roots in two as it brought itself closer until I could feel its heavy, toxic warm breath not far from me. Its movements were swift and careful for a being of its size. I could hear it take in the air, its body flexing as it looked for me with all its senses. I held my breath as much as I could and kept the breaths in between brief. The lack of oxygen started to swerve my senses. The world became blurry, and my arms and legs started to tingle, but I was too scared to breathe any louder or any faster. Just a little longer. Almost there, its body scraped across the tree above me. I closed my eyes and decided that whatever happened, I wouldn't want to see it. This was it, the last call, the final push. The tree rustled again as it began to move, but now its steps became more distant. It was leaving. I hadn't been found. Once it was far enough that I could no longer distinguish its steps, I let out a sigh that nearly knocked me out, shooting stars reflecting along my vision. I laid there for a few minutes, concentrating on my breathing, regaining myself. Once my vision clarified and the world stopped spinning, I continued listening to the sounds of the forest. It was dead quiet. I pressed my ear against the ground and confirmed that the thing was no longer nearby. I took a few more minutes to gather my courage. Staying hidden was less scary, but I knew that I couldn't stay there forever. I was just about ready to continue onwards when a faint sound began to crescendo from the forest. Its familiarity quickly pointed to it being a person's footsteps. But who? I immediately thought of my father, and the problem with that was that I couldn't outrun him. He'd gut me if he found me. From the distance, a voice called Allison. "It's Mommy here. Let me help you." It was my mother's voice, no doubt about it, but different. It stagnated on some syllables, like she was having trouble remembering how some words ended, elongating the previous syllable, until she found the final piece. I stayed hidden and waited to see where she was going, and tried to reason how she could still be alive. And where was Dad? Why was she alone? And was this a trap? "Allison, Mommy is here to help you," she yelled, walking some 50 yards away from me now, heading deeper into the forest. She turned silent again, and I had to strain my ears to pick up her footsteps. If she was here, the others couldn't be far off, and she was heading exactly where I needed to go. I tried to piece together a plan, but it quickly reduced into a game of only bad choices. Through the things and my mom's movements, I regained some sense of direction, and I was somewhat confident on which way the compound was. Going anywhere except where my mom was heading could end up with me face to face with the creature. I could stay here for a while longer, but if the whole group came to search for me, especially in the daylight, I'd be found in a matter of hours, probably even sooner. The only choice was to go where Mom was. I could try talking to her. She might not want any harm to me. She wasn't like Dad. I stretched my legs for a moment and slowly emerged from my hiding place, craning my neck to check every direction for movement. Mom was so deep into the forest by then that I could barely make out her footsteps, so I started slowly jogging towards her, ready to sprint if need be. Soon enough, I spotted her from the back. She walked robotically, lifting her knees extra high with each step, like she was overcompensating with each motion so as not to stumble on the uneven ground. She didn't seem to notice me, even though she was definitely in earshot. For a while, I followed her, hiding behind trees and bushes as she continued onwards. But she was just there, alone, walking towards something, void of any malice. A terrible sadness gripped me, and I remembered how she used to play with me when I was just a kid. She wasn't a good parent by any stretch, but she wasn't a bad person either. She didn't want anyone harmed. She didn't deserve this. And of those few rare memories that still seemed good to me back then, she was a part of. I couldn't just leave her alone like this. "Mom," I said. She kept walking. "Mom," I repeated, louder this time. She stopped in her tracks, standing unnaturally straight. Slowly, she turned around to face me. The moonlight shone through the trees, illuminating her pale features like a statue. My gaze instantly locked onto her head, and the fresh, vivid memory of her brain stuck to my throat immediately brought forth a gag, which echoed through the woods. The skin around her split skull had begun to lazily drape across her head like a bucket hat. It was frayed and dirty, and thick clumps of coagulated blood mixed with dirt and grime drooped from it. Perhaps it was the moonlight, but her eyes looked completely blank, the pupils gone, replaced by nothing but milky whiteness. Fresh blood ran down her cheeks, dripping to her chest and sullying her dress. "Mommy's here now," she said. "Hi, Mom," I said, thinking that if her mind hadn't been ruined, she would surely wish for death. "I'm going to go away. You should too. I know you don't want this. Mom has a present for you, darling." She didn't seem to understand what I was saying. She lifted up her right arm in an awkward arc and began to search for her head with her hand. It took her a few tries until the hand hit the back of her head, and once it did, she grabbed it with all her fingers, making sure not to lose the catch. Her fingers skittered up her head until they hit the bony crater within. Once there, she launched her index finger and thumb inside of her mind, wriggling them as her face took on a pensive note. After a good 10 seconds, her hand emerged, holding a tiny piece of her brain. She placed it on the palm of her other hand and reached it towards me. "This is for you, baby." I swallowed preemptively to fight against the bile, making its way up my throat. "Mom, you need to stop that. I don't want that. Not for me, and not for you." Her face took on a clownish frown, and her palm closed up and squeezed into a tight fist. The piece of brain she held was wet and squishy enough to escape, coming out between her thumb and index finger with considerable force, sending it flying until it landed a few feet in front of her. She didn't seem to notice this, though. "Why don't you want me, darling?" she asked through vague, childish sobs. "Mom, I love you, but this is not what I want. I need to get out. Do you want to come with me? Because we need to hurry. They're coming. Mommy is not enough." "And that's not how it was supposed to go," she said, her voice becoming increasingly muddled and frantic. Although she was now fully sobbing, I couldn't discern any tears coming from her eyes. Like that part of her body no longer worked. She started becoming frantic. Her hands began to shake, and she looked like she was trying to think as hard as she could, the effort straining her face. She reminded me of some of the older people in the group when their minds started to betray them, and they no longer remembered the world which they inhabited and the people that they knew. "Mommy is bad," she began repeating, her inflection sharp and her volume increasingly loud. "Mom, you need to be quiet," I told her, trying to embody some form of authority in my voice. "Mommy's bad," she yelled, her voice cracking and loudly echoing through the forest, filling me with anger towards her. I cursed myself for trusting anyone from that damn cult, even my own mother. They were coming, and now they knew exactly where I was. I tried, didn't I? That's all I could do. I had to keep moving. I tried to run past her, but she suddenly jumped at me and grabbed my arm, bringing us both down on the ground. She twisted my arms and spread them wide as she sat on my legs. She wasn't a large woman by any means, but she could still easily tower over me. As much as I tried to flail myself free using the fury burning inside me, it was in vain, and I quickly stopped moving to conserve my strength, and instead tried to think of a way out. She stared at me. Her face seemed to reset, going completely blank. I again tried to wriggle out of her grasp, but that seemed to trigger her, and she gripped me even tighter. She started to grind her teeth loudly, and thick, yellow spit dripped from the corner of her mouth. "You do have to eat. Do as your father says," she said, her gaze now somewhere beyond. Without warning, she relaxed all of the muscles in her neck, which dropped her head down, her teeth clicking together loudly as her jaw punched her chest. Her brain was now entirely visible to me, and she began to slowly push herself forward. I twisted my neck trying to face away from it, the effort futile. Cold, clumpy spit fell onto my neck. The pink worms of her mind grew closer and closer until she suddenly turned limp, her arms and legs giving out in an instant. My face got the brunt of it as my mouth and nose were inserted inside of her brain, which felt like a bowl of thick, cool noodles. Her serrated skull cut open my lip like a knife, and red-hot pain instantly flared up around my mouth, radiating into my jaw. Once I lifted her head away from mine, I could finally breathe. I was exhausted, and it was nearly impossible to push her limp body off of me, but somehow, I did it. I spat out blood and mucus as I got up. My insides felt like nuclear waste. My wrists and legs were scratched and red, and moving around was difficult. As I got up, I looked over at Mom. Her face was dug into the earth, her dress dirty and muddy and torn. She was dead. It was my fault. I was sure of it. I made this happen. And how horrible must have those last moments have been for her. How her only child hated her so much, and she was confused and frustrated and angry and just wanting to do the thing that they told her to do. My sorrow was interrupted by movement coming from deep in the forest. To stay here would mean certain death, which was not an unappetizing option at that moment. Looking at Mom, I realized that if it would come to that, it would be on my own terms. I would not die at the hands of the group or that dreadful being that they worshipped, like she had. I wouldn't let them. I would be the god of my own death, and so I began to move. Progress was slow, and quickly it became obvious that I couldn't outrun them. I needed to find a hiding place, something secure enough that they couldn't immediately find me. In front of me spanned a monotone forest, flat and scarce for hiding spots, but the ground sloped downwards on my right, where the shadows were more abundant. I decided to follow the slant, and I soon found myself in a stone-walled ravine. They were close behind. I could hear them, and slowly the ground began to shake, and I knew that the thing wasn't far behind either. I marched on, going as fast as I could. If tonight means death, it will not be of their hand. Soon, I noticed that the stone on my right held a spot darker than the rest of the wall, which was barely perceivable in the scant moonlight. A cave. When I walked up to it, from its depths wafted a dank, dense smell. I couldn't see how deep it went, or how well I could hide there, but I doubted that I'd be able to find a better spot. The opening was small enough that I had to bend down to get in, but once inside, I had more than enough room to stand up straight. I hoped that it would not become my tomb. I walked further down, keeping my hand on the wall for guidance. The cave sloped downwards for about 10 yards until it opened up into a small clearing. I found its darkest corner and sat down on the cold, hard rock. From there, I could still see the opening of the cave, but it was unlikely that anyone looking in from the outside could spot me. I held my knees, steadied my breath, and began to wait. It wasn't long until I could hear scattered footsteps above and around me. They were close. I was scared, sure, but the exhaustion had begun to overpower my fear. If it weren't for the constant surges of adrenaline and the overextended fight or flight reaction, I'm sure I would have passed out. My body begged for release, but I had to be awake, even though if they found me, there's not much that I could do. On my own terms, I thought as I stared at the dim light seeping in from the opening of the cave. Not on theirs. I was entranced by the light, staring at it for movement, until suddenly I realized I was shaking from the cold. I squeezed myself tighter, trying to dampen any and all sound that might come out of me. Everything echoed in the cave, and that meant that I needed to be extra careful. They were all around me now, yet I didn't hear any voices. I heard them walking around the forest, searching, yet none of them said a word, and I could no longer hear the things pounding steps either. Something was off. Someone suddenly jumped into the ravine. I could hear him, moving between the stone walls, inching closer to me. I held my breath as he walked past the cave's opening. It was one of the other kids. Jacob, I think. We'd hung out a few times, which was about the amount of times I'd hung out with anyone else in the group, since we'd all grown up together. But he didn't look like him. His eyes were gleaming red, and he moved sporadically, like a puppet. Unsure if it was really Jacob, he would have noticed the hole in the wall. That's the type of stuff kids see, you know, cool sticks, puddles, hiding places, and holes. But he moved right past it, not giving it a second look. This bothered me, but I was grateful that I hadn't been found, at least not yet. The search party began to dissipate, moving further into the forest. I was safe, for now, but I was still stuck. I needed to find a way out, but it would have been suicide to try and walk among 100 children, and that creature still in the forest. I had to wait for dawn. Once I decided to stay in the cave, my body released all that aching tension, and I immediately grew tired and sore, yet comfortably numb. I passed out in what felt like an instant.